Well, hello, folks. It's Jeremy Kirkland. You're listening to Blammo. Are we good? Are you good? This is a special episode this week. It's a bonus Blammo episode. It's a double B. Is that even a thing? God, that's tacky. I am not a copywriter for a good reason. First off, if you're listening to this when it comes out on a Thursday, this slot is usually reserved for the Patreon preview episodes. So twice a month, every other Thursday, these are episodes that are exclusive to our subscribers who support the show and are members of the Blam Fam. The Blam Fam it's our members community. You get access to our Slack community and you get to hear our exclusive shows. We have a Blammo Presents Die Workwear hosted by Derek Guy and the Triple J Show hosted by Gian DeLeon, John Moy, and myself. And also tons more episodes like this. Episodes where we get to get really nitty gritty. So yeah, every other Thursday is always a Blam Fam day, but today, well, first off, it's my birthday. I'm just going to be honest with you. And what better way to celebrate by spending it all with you and giving a little gift to you folks. Don't worry about getting me anything though. I got a new kid. It's like a person. I got a real person. It happened. It took 9 months, but we got him. And I'm most likely going to eat pizza tonight and watch a Sinbad movie. So, I'm good. You don't worry about me. But on this bonus episode, we chat with Cameron Barr of Craft & Tailored. If you're not familiar with Craft & Tailored, they are kind of everything, but they're a watch dealer. He's a vintage watch dealer. He's a car collector, a stereo collector, camera. I mean, he's got all the cool things that you and all your friends text about that you're trying to get or that you get to one up the other friends. He's got it. He's great. But we chat about watches. I mean, we really get into the weeds in it, and it was a ton of fun. But if you like more episodes like this, where we get nitty gritty, consider joining us on Patreon, where you'll get tons more exclusive episodes like this, the other series, and you get to hang out with the Blam Fam. All right? Okay. So breaking through, happy birthday to me, my gift to all of you. Enough of my spiel. I'm going to shut up so you can listen to me talk to someone else. Okay. All right. Here we go. What'd you have for breakfast?
I just ate it. It was a peanut butter granola bar.
Peanut butter granola bar? Is that your usual breakfast?
No, it's not.
What's the usual Cam LA? What is the breakfast you tell people and what is the breakfast you actually eat? Are they different or are they the same?
I don't know if I'm asked that question a lot necessarily, but I actually don't really eat breakfast. I drink it, and it is in the form of like 6 lattes before I get to the office.
6? Yeah. Do you have a home espresso machine?
I drink like 4 cups of coffee a day for sure.
Jeez Louise. Yeah. It's not that bad, I guess, when you think about it.
There's a lot of, it's like there's like the whole milk of the latte, so there's like some good protein and fat there, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. I feel like I was going really hard on my local coffee shop. And at one point I went and did the math on what I was spending, and it was absurd. I was like spending an average of like $30 a day on multiple lattes, dog treats, chocolate croissants. You gotta sometimes, indulge.
Yeah, no, 100%. So I am even more of a freak, and this kind of like stems from like being a watch obsessive and an obsessive with other things. Mm-hmm. But I got into like becoming like my own little mini barista. So I have basically like the Rolls Royce of espresso machines. I don't actually, it's probably not like a Rolls Royce. It's probably like a bespoke 911.
Is this the Breville like OG thing with the little touchscreen?
No. I've got like an ECM Synchronica. So basically like ECM is like it is like the insider's prosumer, like at home barista espresso machine.
Oh shit. I'm looking at this right now.
Yeah. So
Holy
I've got
moly.
2 of those. I have one at my house, and then I also have one in the office. So I basically have like my own, like coffee shop in my house and in my office.
Dual boiler espresso machine, German designed.
Yeah. So I was going to go with a La Marzocco, and then I met somebody who specializes in like this prosumer coffee stuff. He was actually into watches. And I'm like, I've been like dreaming of having a La Marzocco in my home and in my office. And he's like, no. You don't want a La Marzocco. Like La Marzocco is like Ferrari. It's beautiful. They're amazing, but they like break down and there's only like 3 people on the planet that can service them. You want ECM, which is like a Porsche. You can work on it, but it gives you like that same performance and awesomeness. So I ended up getting these these ECM machines. And now I'm like doing my own latte art and measuring my extractions and all that kind of stuff. So that really like, I'm like deep into coffee culture for sure.
Holy shit. So, all the analogies you were making about the coffee also were applied towards cars. What is like your whole thing? Because I feel like for many people, in a good way, you're very mysterious. You're like this watch dealer, but you burst out on the scene. But the thing is, you didn't like burst out like as like this incremental thing. It was very much fully formed. Like you launched, like Crafts and Tailored was a thing. You had inventory, you had gear, you already had knowledge, you already had this stuff. So like trace me pre Crafts and Tailored Cameron.
Yeah, you know what's funny is I never thought I would be doing this. I was a watch nerd. So I was in the technology business, and you and I were just talking about food. But I think what's funny is like I was a C-level executive within a tech company, and I also worked with other C-level executives. And so my day normally revolved around food, and I'm not like a big food guy at all. So I'd have a breakfast meeting, a lunch meeting, or a dinner meeting. And it was always like about like entertainment. That's like how you would get the C-suite meeting. You're like, we're going to go to this 5-star restaurant. Do you want to like take a meeting with me so I can sell you a bunch of shit? So what ended up happening was I was kind of always like the renegade and the outsider in like the corporate C-suite world. Like my suits were always bespoke. My shoes were always bench made. I never bought anything like off the rack, you know, and my peer group was like, oh, luxury and coolness is a McLaren or this brand new Lambo or this new like yellow gold Yachtmaster. And for me, I was like, well, anybody with enough money can go buy that stuff. I don't want to floss and flex in a way that is like really publicly noticeable. I want to get into stuff that is, you know, kind of like if you know, right?
Okay.
And so that's kind of where my obsession with like detail and all that kind of started. It was kind of like my fuck you to the man, because I hated working in the corporate space. I hated kind of the man, so to speak, because it was just, there was no like substance. There was no genuineness in any of that kind of stuff. It was just kind of just a flex. And like, you can't buy style and taste, right? Like style and taste doesn't equate to like a monetary number ever. So in any case, that's kind of how I got into watches. I wanted watches and things like that as an accessory that were kind of under the radar, that were on the outside, that, you know, it wasn't even about the money. It was about, you know, maybe it was like a cool vintage Seiko or something like that, but it had something that like, you know, maybe it was like the only watch in that room, in that state, in that part of the country that I had. And that to me was like real tangible exclusivity. So
like the folks that you were okay, so you're out at dinner. This is pre-Craft and Tailored.
Yep.
You're at the tech dinner. Is this basically just a lot of Submariners?
It was a lot of, it was like a lot of ceramic subs. It was a lot of, you know, and back then, this was probably say in God, this is like 8 years ago at this point, you could still get that stuff. So a lot of it was like, it wasn't even like good Brioni suits. It was like,
oh yeah. What was the suits you were making? Who was making your suits?
There's a gentleman who, he still makes my suits. His name is Todd, and he's just a clothier who, kind of started off at, kind of like a custom men's clothier, and then he went independent. And so we were pulling like fabric off of like old dead stock bolts of fabric from like Seville Row. And I was wearing like these like really crazy suits, not loud, but like, suits with like dead stock fabrics, with functioning buttonholes, with, like roped sleeves, with pick stitch lapels, and doing things that were kind of like interesting and cool that like I knew about, but nobody else knew about. And that kind of translated into watches. So, going back to how I got into becoming a watch dealer is I wanted something that was like really cool and something that had like substance. And this jeweler that I was working with, that was like kind of a friend, I said, hey, next time something old and vintage and Rolex comes in the door, let me know. And so he calls me one day and he's like, hey, I don't know if you're going to be into this, but there's this old guy who's selling this Submariner. And the Submariner was a reference 5513. It was from 1967.
It's the non-chronometer sub?
Yep. So it's a 2-liner. And the watch was in like a really kind of like distressed state. It needed work. It was missing the crown. It was missing a bezel. And so I ended up like offering like $750 for this watch, right? Even parts back then, that was like a screaming deal. The parts on that watch alone now are like probably $8,000 or $9,000, right? And so what I had to do is I had to like work with the community to figure out how to service the watch, how to find the exact crown for, you know, that year, 1967. I had to find a bezel insert. And what happened is I kind of like slipped down this slope into this like deep dark hole of learning why Rolex used this specific crown during this year, why they used this insert, why is it a Mark III versus a Mark IV, why is the luminous compound this versus that, right? And so like through kind of this my first watch, which was a sub, I had to kind of like restore it. And as a result of like finding the components and the parts for this watch, I just became obsessed with like, you know, the technical history of these things and the mechanical, you know, development of these things. And so when I was on the road, I would have like these various meetings where, you know, I was.
So you're still working for the company?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
And what I would do is like, I would have these gaps of time in my schedule where it'd be like, all right, I had my breakfast meeting. My next meeting isn't until like 8 and I'm in the middle of Texas. So I'm going to go to every pawn shop and like try to find like these cool little watches. And I started to amass this collection of watches, and I would find these great deals. I'd be like in the middle of nowhere and I'd be like, oh, here's a date just for $500. Here's a sub for $1,000. And
wait. What? Why are these, was this just kind of the going rate for the price at the time? I don't even remember when subs and Datejusts were that cheap.
Yeah. What's wild is I'm kind of the new kid on the block in terms of, I would say, like the recognized vintage dealers in the world, and
sure,
and not tooting my own horn, that's just kind of what has happened as a result of having done this for the past, I guess now going on 7 years professionally. So when I first got into the business, like officially, Datejusts were like $2,000. Subs, like a really nice 5513 was $6,500, you know? And back then that wasn't cheap. That wasn't expensive. Sure. That's just what the price was. So over the past 7, to 10 years, we've seen explosive growth within the vintage watch market. And also we're seeing people, get into the details like, oh, this is a meters first sub versus a feet first sub. Oh, this is a gilt dial versus a matte dial. Or this is a Mark I versus a Mark II versus and back then I was nerding out on that stuff. I was looking for all the little sub variants and like all the little things. But a lot of people, they're like, hey, this is a matte dial Submariner. And it could be a meters first, or it could be a feet first, or it could be a maxi dial, or whatever.
Where are you learning this stuff? Because I think like that's the thing that, a lot of people, whether they are in the industry brand new or for a very long time, all the stuff you're talking about with Rolex, and I say this for people who don't know, Rolex does not publish like, hey, here's our history. Here's every different variation, and here's when it was made, and here's when, so like, where are you finding this and learning it?
Back then it was a lot of the internet. There was a lot of like vintage Rolex forums.
Okay, VRF. Like Network 54?
Network 54. It was dealing with other guys. It was, other dealers, other collectors. And the thing that's really cool is like the community in itself it was, at least back then, very welcoming to people that wanted to learn about it or to compare. And people, there was these discussions that were happening to kind of uncover and to document the history of Rolex and other vintage watches like Omega Speedmasters or Patek Philippe or Vacheron Constantin or whatever. So the community back then, I think, was much more open than it is now. And a lot of it was in books. So I just started like grabbing every single book I could find.
Like the Mondani stuff, or?
Yeah, like Giorgio Mondani is actually now a personal friend of mine. But back then I was reading like all the Mondani books, and I was looking at old auction catalogs. I was buying auction catalogs off of like the internet,
That's a really good idea.
Yeah, I have a collection of auction catalogs that like Christie's, Sotheby's, Phillips, that like dates back 8-9 years, and I'm like trying to find, like I'm almost like collecting auction catalogs now, like somebody would baseball cards. So I'm going out to try to find those catalogs to go, oh, this watch auctioned in 2008 for this much, and now it's in front of me at this. And and it's also really good because a lot of what we do is authentication. Like we authenticate watches. We're looking for changes. Did the bezel change? Was the dial screwed with? Like, so you can kind of now, as a result of the internet and these kind of archives, you can kind of track a watch's physical history, and that helps when you're authenticating a watch or whatever.
Yeah. So you're getting into watches. You're starting to buy some of this stuff, and you're basically learning from old catalogs and Mondani books. Which, by the way, I think is the only way and place to learn any of that. I mean, especially at the time with like message boards and stuff. I mean, that was just kind of how you learn. But it was also in a good way. I think it was like kind of where people like all learned together through people's mistakes. Like I remember a guy had gotten a watch on one of the Rolex forums and he was like, it's this, it's a blank and blank. And people were like, that dial was never made with that watch. And it was just like, everybody's like devastated at the same time. Like, did that happen with you at all? Like, did you buy some of the wrong things?
It was funny. I was doing like a Q&A the other day, and that's a question that comes up a lot. And fortunately for me, I just like pour myself into research. I pour myself into looking at comparables and that kind of stuff. And I haven't really made any like major mistakes. I've taken risks on things that didn't end up being what they ultimately need to be. Like, for example, like sometimes I'm looking at a photograph and, very respectfully speaking, it's like an 85-year-old man on the other end who's using like a Nokia or like a Motorola Razor or whatever to like take photos of this watch. And I'm like, you might as well be taking pictures of this watch with a potato, because like, I can't really even like, I'm like, can you show me the serial number? And the guy's like, how do I take the bracelet off? And it's like, okay, I'm in those situations less frequently now, but back then that was kind of the jam. And, that's, I think, going back to your point, the community, there was like a lot of welcome, kind of like, hey, I found this, I need some help. And then kind of the community would chime in. There wasn't like this thing that was like happening where people were like, oh, look at that idiot who bought like a redone dial or whatever. And I think back then too, there wasn't as much like to gain. I've seen that kind of in other auxiliary markets as well, like within like the vintage automotive market, where people weren't like manipulating stuff to gain, because it was less recognized. The market, I would say, back then was much more pure and honest. And people just didn't give a shit about it as much. They were like, it's a vintage watch, it's an old watch. There were guys like me that were obsessing over like, the serifs and the font and the glossiness of the dial and the serial number and the, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's the thing too. Because I mean, our like mutual buddy, Eric Wynn, has talked about how like the explosion in altering. And you had talked about this too when we had lunch the other day, where like, it's not so much that the watches are fake. I'm air quoting that word. It's that like some of these watches, I'm just going to pull an example out of the air where it's like, okay, the watch is real, but the Tiffany stamp is not. You know what I mean? And it's in some of those things, especially with like Rolex, you can't track the exact, issue papers of this. And Rolex is like, oh yes, we made that serial with a Tiffany stamp. It was, some of those things were done locally, some of those. And so like, that's been a newer thing that I think a lot of people are seeing now, where it's like, yeah, the watch is real, the age is correct, all this stuff, but I'm making this up, like the stamp is incorrect, or the hands are wrong or something. I actually had an
interesting situation happen yesterday, and I'm on the road a lot, meeting with clients and inspecting watches and literally chasing this stuff around the world. But I was here in LA. I was at our headquarters, and we're like jewelry district adjacent. So, New York has 47th Street, which is huge. We also kind of have our own version of 47th Street here in LA. It's Hill Street, and it's basically like not even a quarter of the size of like what is in New York, right? For diamonds and gold and so we're like the vintage go-to here in LA. Like if something old comes in, like we get the call, we get the WhatsApp, we get the text, whatever. So this, what's that? Yeah. So,
I said, right.
I get a WhatsApp message from a dealer that specializes kind of just in like everything. He's more of a jeweler, but does watch stuff. And this guy's offering him like a 70s era Rolex Oyster perpetual date. The reference was 5100. And it had like this really rare Arabic dial. So the numbers around the dial were in Arabic, and it had an Arabic date wheel as well. And so one had just auctioned, I think in November, for like 27,000 CHF. And a pretty important watch. So the watch looked a little bit weird. And again, I'm getting like these kind of like grainy crap iPhone photos. So I was like, all right, I'm local. It'll take me 10 minutes to walk over. So I ended up inspecting the watch yesterday. And to your point, the watch was genuine. The case, the movement, the serial number, the date wheel, everything was there, but somebody at some point had refinished the dial. So the plots on the dial, the Arabic numbers on the dial, the cornet, all of that was original, but somebody had like basically wiped out the dial and then refinished it. So like the markers on the minute track, the little ticks on the outside of the numbers, those were off. The Rolex printing was off. So that was a watch that ended up being a pass for us because the dial had been refinished, but the dial was original. It just, again, it would be like taking like a Picasso and then like being like, it's got some patina. Let's wipe that off and then repaint this Picasso, which of course like devalues the watch, kind of rendering it as on.
How does that conversation go? Because I imagine there's a lot of ego in the room and you kind of have to, you're basically thumbs up or thumbs down Caesar moment here. Like, what is that get
it
weird?
It does. Yeah. It's something that I've really learned to refine. And our friend Eric Wind, I actually took a page out of his book where he basically like says, and I hope Eric doesn't get mad at me for saying this, but it's like such a funny thing and we laugh about it, but he'll go, well, sadly, the dial has been refinished. Right. And he kind of says like, oh, well, sadly, this isn't for me, and it kind of puts like the like, hey, it just is what it is, versus me being the guy where, in my younger dealing career, I'd be like, okay, well, this is wrong and this is wrong and this is wrong and this is why it's not going to sell. And so for me now, what I kind of do is just remove myself, and I'm just saying, hey, as a subject matter expert, like, this is my opinion, and sadly, it's been refinished, so this isn't, but there are those moments where I mean, there's been so many weird stories where like I've had like somebody that's going through a divorce and they're wanting to sell watches and then they bring in stuff and I'm like, yeah, well, your husband really didn't get you, a sub. This isn't legit, and there's been like instances like that where, you kind of have to be the bearer of bad news. And
sorry, this was included in the divorce, but he was so inclined to give it to you because
you may want to check your tennis bracelet as well. Like, yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah. That's a real drag, but I mean, it's good to have that. I mean, it's obviously like telling the truth is good. It's just that when it's that person is totally ignorant to it. Or maybe not, right?
Yeah,
I mean, who knows?
And there's that saying, it's like, ignorance is bliss, right? Like, that's the thing. It's like, sometimes I just know so much and I've accumulated this knowledge, and I just sometimes wish I could go back and just go like, oh man, this is just cool. I like this because of this, without going like, okay, let me verify that the serial number is in the correct production range for this and that, and let me look at the text, and let me hit it with ultraviolet to inspect the luminous material and all that kind of stuff. And so, it's a bittersweet thing. I think for me, what ended up happening is I amassed this collection of watches, and then Wall Street and being in big tech kind of just burnt me out, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. But as a result of me getting involved in the community, I had kind of developed some friends and some people that, I was kind of watch trading with. And then I kind of started to feel guilty because I had amassed a collection of watches. And I can only wear so much, it's like, do I really need, 10 5513s in a collection when I'm only really wearing one?
Blasphemy here. So yeah, I mean, it's very refreshing to hear you say that, by the way, because I have a bunch of friends, including myself, where, I mean, I don't have a ton of watches, but I have things that I'm like, I totally need that. And then you realize that, like, but do you need it? Or are you just like, now you're starting to hoard? Like what is that? How do you?
Well, I mean, for me now, I can legitimize my hoarding because like I'm like, oh well, this is just an inventory, right? So it's like,
this is for sale.
And the funny thing is like I have like it's funny because I kind of have like these little like mini romances with these watches sometimes, and sometimes like the romance is like so intense that I'm like I don't want to let something go. So I won't move on my price or whatever it is. Right. Cause like, I love the watch so much. And I think the thing that, I share with a very select few other dealers is that I'm also a collector myself. So, there will be things that come in where I'm there are watches that I'm looking for. Like there are watches out there that I'm like chasing for myself, and not everything is for sale. The thing that has been challenging, I would say, in the past, 3 to 4 years, especially, is that if I'm meeting with a client to deliver a watch or to advise on a collection, or kind of help them navigate the collecting process, sometimes I can't wear my own watches because people are like, well, what are you wearing and why are you wearing it? And then I've like had to have that thing where I'm like, oh, this isn't for sale. It's actually my personal watch. And then they're like, well, what?
Like the Paul Newman on your wrist right now? Like I just caught wind of that. Yeah. Jeez Louise.
This one is for sale, but I'm having a romance with it for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Has there ever been a situation where, like, I'm sure you get asked this question a lot, but like someone has something that's crazy and they're unaware of the value, and where, like, I remember, maybe it's not even true, but like someone like went up to this person and they were like, hey, I have this watch. It was a dealer that we know, and the watch that they had was crazy rare, and what they wanted for it was like a 16th of what it was actually worth, and the dealer was like, actually it's worth this and I'll give you that. Like, has that happened?
Through. And what's kind of crazy is that, again, kind of being the younger dealer and one of the new kids on the block. And I say that after having been in the business for now, 8 years professionally. I've been collecting probably for like 12 to 14 years. The thing that is interesting is, like, I'm still always on the hunt. Like, I love hunting watches. And yesterday, even going into, kind of onto the street, so to speak, and looking at watches, like I couldn't help myself but to like go just look through the cases, because you just never know what you're going to find. It's like, it's an addiction,
right?
For sure. But I think, for me, it's easier to bring people in and say, hey, listen, this is worth this. And that honesty and that kind of transparency has perpetuated additional business for us, an additional connection.
Oh, that's good.
So, I've been in that situation where, you're looking at an estate piece and they have no idea what it's worth. And then you kind of educate them. And then it really creates a tight bond with, that customer, that contact, which then kind of perpetuates itself to other people. And I think that that's the great thing that is a result of being in the internet and being present on social media and that kind of stuff, is that when you take care of people, word gets around, just as if like you were to, if you were to fuck somebody over, word would also get around. Right. And so it's
right.
Yeah,
it
really is small, especially now, with the internet. The negative side to that is you have like a lot of like couch quarterbacks, I guess is the term for that, right? Like the guys that are like trying to throw like the long pass from their couch and they're not actually in the game and on the field. So you have these kind of like, keyboard warrior experts that are like, well, I don't know if that existed. I don't know. And then I'm like, guy, I've looked at like 5,000 of these. I'm telling you based on my experience that this is a known example or whatever. And so there's that kind of side to the internet and to this communication, where you have a lot of people that are experts, but they haven't had a lot of hands-on experience with the subject matter. And their experience, if you really peel back the layers of the onion, is very limited. And they're just kind of like providing this internet-based opinion, which can sometimes do the opposite of what I think is positive.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely something that, like the Hoodinky comment section, which I feel so bad for the folks there, because some of the stuff I read, I'm like, what? Why are we getting personal all of a sudden, where somebody's reflecting on somebody's personal life or something that's happened, and it's like, you don't even have to, like, you don't have to be the reply guy or like the hot take of whether or not that watch was true or existed. I mean, it's a shit show.
I've learned to kind of also just kind of keep my opinions to myself in some cases too, especially when you're dealing with like a real high visibility thing, So I met this really interesting guy, and his name is Brian Ray, and he's the guitar player for Paul McCartney. And he's like this really amazing guitar player. He was like, he was on,
clearly.
I mean, he's like the dude.
He's playing with the Beatles.
And this really cool dude. And he's not even a watch collector. He has one watch, and it's a Cartier Roadster.
Oh,
and
that's a cool
we met
watch.
and we were talking about vintage guitars and just kind of like collecting.
Yeah.
And he collects like vintage guitars and cars and all this kind of stuff. And we weren't really talking about collecting watches at all. But the vintage guitar world and the vintage car world and the architecture world and the fashion world, they all kind of like intermingle, as you know. And so we were, talking about vintage watches, and he's like, I love this Cartier, like it's a steel Cartier Roadster. But, there's this guy that like was like, "Oh, Brian, that's a real shit watch. You should get something that's like really whatever." He's like, my niece just told me, she's like, don't yuck somebody else's yum, right? And that's the thing that I think is so interesting about the watch world. And I really resonated with that. It's like, don't yuck somebody's yum. Like, maybe you're into like quartz watches. Maybe you're into Swatch watches. Maybe you have a different opinion. Maybe you have a different taste. I think for me, with my opinions and what it is that I'm, personally into from a taste perspective, it's all ice cream. You like pistachio, I like chocolate, you like whatever, and I think that is really for me where like a lot of the learning still takes place, and a lot of like the perspective of growth for me. There's things that I never thought I would be into that I'm now like absolutely obsessed with within the watch world. And I like Vacheron Constantine. Like I think Vacheron is like their watches out of the 60s and the 70s, there's so much cool stuff that nobody is considering. 18 karat gold, like, Calatrava style time only watches that have these beautiful and ornate dials. Their casework and their movement finishing is comparable to Patek Philippe, in my opinion. Same thing with Cartier. I've gotten into Cartier over like the past like 3 or 4 years, where I never thought I'd wear like a gold tank. Now I love, tanks and that kind of stuff. So it's not just sports watches for me. It's not just Paul Newman's. And I have a definite passion for those. But, again, it's through kind of meeting with this community and dealing with other collectors and looking at a wide kind of broad element of subject matter that allows my taste to kind of constantly be evolving and changing. And that's how I still get excited about this.
Right. Stuff. Yeah. One of the things that like caught me by surprise when, I had met you and we were talking about Crafts and Tailored and your brand and stuff is for a lot of watch companies and watch, dealers per se, the focus is always solely on watches, right? But like going on Crafts and Tailored, there's car stuff, there's like guitars, there's art, there's like, walk me through why you were kind of like looking at this as like an entire world versus a singular channel.
Man, Kirkland, you really know what you're doing over there. That's a pivot if I've ever seen one.
I'm sorry. I hope it's not unwelcome.
No, dude, it's awesome. Like you really like, I'm also a fan of your pod, and I think the guests that you have, and not to just blow smoke up your skirt, I think like the content that you're producing is kind of like, I resonate with that, because to your point, Craft and Tailored is more than just watches, and that's kind of like our funny tagline. But what ended up happening is, like, you're right, a lot of dealers are just solely focused on like watch. And the only other person that really kind of blended, I think, watches and the art and the lifestyle and all that other stuff that surrounded them was Houdinki. And so I also resonated with that. And, I think for us, I found myself in these positions where I was sitting down with these like really awesome, influential people that were subject matter experts in other auxiliary fields, whether it be automotive or, fashion or design. And if I really peel back the layers of that onion, I started to think about why I was into watches. Well, I think it's like my espresso machine. I'm into like, the way that, the E61 brew group works in this machine, and that it has braided stainless steel, tubing instead of like copper, right? Or why like Aerosarin made, this design versus that sign, where Charles and Ray Ames did this kind of stuff. And then I was like, oh man, I'm into all these other things. Like, why don't we use this thing that I do for a living as a jump off point and talk about the kind of crossover between fashion and architecture and art? And instead of kind of just being like, oh, that was a cool conversation, go like, well, wait a minute, let's like create some content around that. Let's like explore that. Let's celebrate that. I think one of the articles that you had probably seen was like our interview with Johan Lamb from 316. And I love 316's attention to detail, the fabrics that they use, the stitching, the inspiration behind their items. It also just so happens that Johan is also into watches. So it's been really cool. That is definitely a part of our brand, and that's something we're definitely leaning into. We did an interview with Devon Turnbull from OHAS. So Devon came out of the lifestyle world and is into hi-fi audio and is like basically a a wizard when it comes to like hi-fi and audio. I also love records. I also love the history of hi-fi and audio. And so we interviewed Devon and we kind of talked about, the similarities between watches and sound design and collecting, old Altec speakers from, the 40s and the 50s and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, you definitely called me out on that, which is something that's cool, which is we are definitely exploring kind of the auxiliary markets and leaning into the other things. And as a brand, we're starting to do more collaborations that are outside of watches. Does that mean that we're going to stop selling watches or stop, doing that? No, not at all. But are we going to create content and lean into that and kind of celebrate that? For sure. And I think that's where the growth of our brand ultimately lies, is in this other kind of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I totally hear you. I mean, because that's when you look at watch companies now or watch brands or dealers like that, now they're kind of like, oh shit, like, I need to be able to sell all the other things that are in the picture of the watch that I took, right? Like, everyone's got the watch like next to an Eames or next to, it's on the Macintosh amp or something. And it's like being able to be like, oh, PS, you can also buy that here. I mean, I think is huge. That being said, as we were saying, do you ever see yourself getting into like maybe more clothes stuff? Like denim because you wear it and you have it, but
yeah. And I think the funny thing is like people, I've had to kind of be a little bit careful, and not for the sake of me not wanting to like bite off more than I can chew, but like I'm a Porsche collector. I'm into clothing. I'm into denim. I'm into hi-fi and all that kind of stuff. And I think the plan for us is going to be to kind of talk about what we're into or what I'm into, and then kind of use that as platform to talk more about it and to kind of promote it, but maybe not necessarily specialize in it as much as, say, the other industry leading expert would. And that's kind of what we've done with almost like Johan from 316. I think I'd love to do like a cool little collaboration with them, but ultimately like point people to those little areas and kind of, in the truest sense, maybe inspire people to think about other stuff. But to specialize in just like, are we going to open up a hi-fi shop and also start selling vintage Porsches? No. And I get asked a lot like, hey, will you help me buy and sell a Porsche, or buy and sell this? And I'm like, hey, totally, appreciate that, but that's just not what we do. We do this, but these are the people that you're going to want to talk to. And these guys are kind of like vetted by, let's say, like the Craft and Tailored, family, so to speak. So, but yeah, I think we'll do some collabs and that kind of stuff for sure. And we'll definitely get into more like little fun, like lifestyle products and things like that. Yeah, for sure.
What are your thoughts on the fact that like it feels that a lot of watch companies now it's not that they do new releases anymore that just have to stand on its own. It feels like many watch companies, their new release involves a collab, to where it's like, and I don't say this to call brands out, but it's like, it's somewhat strange to me that it's almost that like just everything now, whether it's clothes, but it definitely feels like that in watches, are a collab. Oh, we're doing this limited edition with this. And it's like, what is a limited edition in 2022? A general release? Like,
yeah, I think that's really interesting. Eric from Undefeated just did a collab with Mosier, which I think is kind of interesting. And it is a true limited collab. And it's like a really interesting kind of like streetwear skate kind of like, high fashion meeting like hot high horology. And I think that collab is kind of cool. I like both brands. And I think that is kind of an interesting thing. Is Mosier going to do more of that? Maybe. And I think that in essence could kind of degrade the limited editionness of some stuff. Mm-hmm. I think we had that really happen with like Panerai, for example. Panerai was like this really cool heritage historic brand. And then it's like every Panerai you see on the market, it's like, oh, it's the limited edition, Olympics version. It's the limited edition. It was Thursday, March, 22nd of, 2011 version. Oh, it's the limited. And then like the exclusiveness just gets like real watered down. And then you're like, well, everything's a limited edition. I think that it can be done in a tasteful way, but I also think that there are people that are just like reaching for the collab, and there's not true like substance behind what that is. So I think to your point, I definitely love like the little limited edition collabs that some of these brands are doing, but also I think it just depends on how it's executed. And I think that is ultimately going to either produce something that is sustainable and actually truly collectible, or something that's just hyped out. And that's also something that I deal a lot with in my own head is like is this truly collectible? Is this truly exclusive? Or is this just part of the hype machine? And I'm not really a big fan of just the hype machine. If that's me shooting myself in my own foot, fine. But like, I'm just not a real big hype guy.
Yeah, honestly. Like I think, you know, with so many limited editions, there are still great things that come out, you know, but how, like we were talking about, like how saturated limited editions can be, you know, I sometimes like, okay, is this the asshole cynic Jeremy that's like coming out, or is this like, you know, what is a way, you know, where everything can be nice? Like, well, 20 years from now, will we look back at like, you know, the teens and the 2020s as like the over limited editions? I don't know. I mean, anyway, yeah.
I think, you know, I think we're in a really weird crossroads, and I think that you have a generation that has come up within the hype machine that has bought like the crazy expensive t-shirt that is now like trading for like nothing on Grailed or whatever.
Yeah.
I think that the thing that I love about vintage watches is, you know, regardless of the price point, you can actually find and maintain tangible exclusivity and things that are actually like substantial. You know, you look at like a Seiko from the 60s, like a Willard, for example.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's a cool watch. That's an icon. It has, you know, technical development. It has history, has all those things, and it's not even really that expensive. Same way as if you look at like a Daytona or something like that. There's an element of that being an icon in itself, which to me makes me feel that I have something that is real and substantial versus like, you know, like a random dial with a random text on it, or something that has like some ridiculous colorway and it's a limited edition, but it's like the 5th limited edition of the brand.
Right.
And I'm kind of with you there. I'm not really a hype guy, and maybe I think I have a responsibility in a way to kind of educate people as to what something that is sustainable and substantial in that world is, regardless of the price point.
Yeah.
And I think we do that by, to your point, storytelling and explaining the history. And, you know, if you're buying something, you're not just buying this for the logo or the brand or whatever, you're buying the history, the technical development, you know, like all those things. And that to me is what is sustainable and also substantial in terms of the item itself.
Right. Do you think there'll be, you know, is there a watch now that will look back that would be like the Captain Willard or whatever, in the sense that like that watch was not a intentional collaboration? It was basically just worn in Apocalypse Now. So, you know, the Seiko Turtle that was worn in Apocalypse Now, that then people, you know, that nickname became from that association that was completely unintentional. Do you think that there's anything that's happening now that's totally unintentional?
I have a funny story for you.
Okay, this is the place.
So my dentist, who is also a watch collector, who I became friends with as a result of him being like a watch collector, and I've sold him some really amazing pieces, is kind of a celebrity old school dentist in LA, and he works on Martin Sheen's teeth. So Martin comes in one day and he's like wearing a Willard because he knows Martin's coming in. He's like, look, I'm wearing my Captain Willard. Martin Sheen has like no idea. He's like, what are you talking? And he's like, you don't know? And he's like, dude, you have a watch that has like the nickname of your character in Apocalypse Now. And he's like, I had no idea like that this is like a thing. Right. And then like, you know, of course he like pulls it up on his phone. He's like, look, and he's like blown away that he has like this watch that is associated with his character in this film. So it was funny because he told me that story, and I just thought it was so cool that, you know, like this guy who plays this iconic character who's obviously like a major actor, and kind of an icon in himself, like has no idea that he has like a Seiko.
Right? Like, so do you think there's anything that's happening now that we'll look back and say?
I mean, yeah, I think there's some things. I mean, you know, a lot of like the really interesting APs with complications, I think that those are true limited edition production pieces, which, you know, that's like art meeting technical, like excellence meeting iconic brand. So I think that stuff could definitely be something that is kind of like the Paul Newman of our generation. The thing that I think is different now than it was back in the day is that I don't think we're producing anything now that is ultimately going to become an icon as a result of it needing to meet form, meeting function, meeting design. And what I mean by that is like, if you look at the turtle, for example, the reason that it's, named, the turtles because the crown is kind of offset and the crown is kind of like in like the 4 o'clock position.
And the case is all
of the case, and the case kind of looks like a turtle shell or whatever, right? And all of that stuff is a result of like Seiko as a brand trying to advance the development of this dive watch. And so I don't think we're in a position today where brands and or people are developing something based on form meeting function meeting a design element. I think that time ultimately for us is kind of really past. It's like, how do you recreate an icon? And I think that's the thing that the brands are really struggling with, whether it be watches or automotive or whatever. I don't know if, and I don't know if I'm answering your question. I'm just giving you, because I've thought a lot about this.
Yeah.
But, it's like, how does Porsche recreate the 911? They have to sell more units. They're a manufacturer. Like you can't do anything to the 911 that is going to like wildly like turn it into, it already is an icon. Right. I think the same thing with Rolex. It's like, look at I'm a huge fan of Rolex and maybe I'm like doing myself a disservice by saying this, but like, look what Rolex is doing with, their current production. And this is mind boggling. People are like, oh, this is going to be limited edition. This is going to be collectible. It's like, okay, the Oyster Perpetual with, like the colored dial. People don't really look at that for what it is. It's the easiest watch for Rolex to produce. It comes in every size that will work for any human, right? It's the least complicated movement.
Right.
And to change the color on a dial and call it limited edition is like the easiest thing for a brand to do. So like for them to do that, people are like, oh, this is groundbreaking. This is amazing. And I'm like,
yeah, it's the same case about? For like a Datejust and stuff too. So it's not, yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. It's like this movement isn't they're the lowest end Rolex that you can buy. I'm not talking crap on its prestige or its main.
Yeah.
But it's like people are like losing their shit over this. And I'm like, am I like the only idiot here that thinks that this is a load of shit? Like, what do you mean? Like, this isn't, they literally just changed the color of the dial. And there's no like technical excellence. This isn't an icon. Same thing with like, the new GMT that they released. I'm like
the Destro, the left hand.
The Destro. Yeah. I'm like, you guys didn't even change the position of the date window.
That's true.
You literally just took the watch, flipped it upside down, redid the logo, moved the 6 o'clock marker to the 12 o'clock and the 12 o'clock to the 6, and just printed everything upside down. And people are freaking out about this. And I'm like, this is crap. This to me says the brand literally cannot become an innovator and is struggling with their own identity because they have created an icon. And I think that that's a really hard position for a lot of like these manufacturers to be in that have created icons. And instead of looking back at their history and their heritage and just doing like really cool things that accent the originals, they're like doing like these wild things that I don't think are going to be ultimately sustainable.
Yeah. I mean, because thinking about it now, I guess a brand doesn't make an icon, right? Like an icon is made by somebody else through the brand. Like the Paul Newman, that was not a special watch. I mean, they call it the exotic dial, but like, whatever. It was not, it was iconic by the people who used it, wore it, whatever. So like Paul Newman made it, subs by divers, all these other things. So it's just like, yeah, what is it? And maybe it's because we're so reliant on our phones, a watch is in some ways has kind of relegated itself to jewelry versus a tool, even though we will buy them as like, oh, but this, I could dive 1,000 feet, or 1,000 meters underwater. It's like, yeah, but you're not. I mean, it's like, but I could, and now I have it, and now I can.
Right. You're like, I'm going to get, a Rolex, Sea Dweller James Cameron because like, I'm for sure going to dive.
I'm going to the Mariana Trench.
And I'm like, you're literally wearing a Maytag fridge on your wrist.
Right.
And like, are you even going to go snorkeling in this watch? I think that there is an element of like vibe and coolness around the watch being able to technically do that, which is amazing. Like, I think that from a technical perspective, to create a watch that can withstand those pressures and do the collaboration with James Cameron, I think that's amazing. But like, to offer that as a production model to like the general public, I think is kind of ridiculous. And I think, to your point, it's like, how do you recreate an icon? What's wild and what's interesting is that we've actually been working with a few heritage brands, and not a lot of people know about this, and we can talk about it on the pod. I can't name drop yet, but we've actually been working with some brands that have actually tapped on us to help them kind of rediscover their heritage. And you would think that would be something that would be like so easy for a brand to do, but I think just through time, like the creative people and the technical people have just kind of like moved through the brand to where they're like, we have this amazing history and heritage, but we're like producing like these total garbage things, whether it be clothing or, in our case, watches or whatever. And they're like, hey, can you help us kind of rediscover our history? And as a vintage watch collector, what would you want to see in the modern variation of this? How can we pull elements of our past while leveraging, technical excellence through modern manufacturing and kind of just the modern era to create something that is maybe an homage to the past while leveraging these other things? And that's been a really fun thing to create and kind of do. And I feel honored to be tapped on the shoulder by some of these brands to be doing that. So, we're doing that. And I think that's also an element of Craft and Tailor that not a lot of people know about, but through this appreciation of history and having become an expert in the field of horology and studying it and learning it over and over and over again, we're now acting kind of as a consultant for some of these brands to help them kind of like rediscover themselves through the past, which I think is really cool.
I hope some of your advice consisted of the phrase "make it smaller."
Most definitely. Yeah, we were tapped on the shoulder by a company, and I'm like, first order of business,
make it smaller.
Stop making everything in 42 millimeter. Just stop. Like, nobody, like, it's too large. So we've done that, and the cool thing is, like, some of these brands are like really hesitant. They're like, "Are you sure?" I'm like, "Yes, I'm really sure." The amount of small watches we've been selling, but by modern standards, small.
You're air quoting.
We sell a lot of Air Kings. We sell a lot of Date Justs. I mean, most people don't understand, like, what size do you think this 6240 Palm?
Well, I think I know the size, right? It's 39 or 38.7 or something.
It's 36.
Get the fuck out of here. Is it?
I
really?
Swear. Yeah.
Wow,
so the mid case of this watch is actually 36. It's the same size as a Date Just, but the way that everything is executed on this watch makes it wear more like a 40 millimeter, right? So that's the other thing to consider too when you're looking at these designs, is that like the bezel, the dial layout, the length of the hands, the length of the lugs, like the pushers, all that weighs into this design where it's like they're like right off the bat, like a watch manufacturer today goes, "Oh, we're gonna make it in 42 millimeter." Okay, great. And then they build this watch around a 42 millimeter case, and then it becomes like a 44 millimeter watch or 45 or whatever. And you're like, this is just huge.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I could be mistaken, but I had heard in the past that most of the size increase over the years was for the Russian market, and then the Asian market, which at the times it was the hottest and like the most profitable for them of watches and stuff like that, and so they just kind of kept like ratcheting upwards. But that is hearsay. I'm not saying that is the truth, but like that's what I heard from other friends of mine who had been in the industry. So who knows?
I think there's validity to that, and I think the other thing is that like with these collaborations and all this kind of stuff. I'll take a page out of my Porsche mechanics book. His name is Marco Grace, and he owns this company called TLG here in LA. And we actually did an article on Marco, and it's on our journal. But Marco's also a watch guy, and Marco has some really good taste in watches, as he does in kind of like restoring and building these like amazing 911s. Mm-hmm. And the thing that's funny is like Marco comes to me for watch advice. He's like, "What do you think about this?" And I'm like, "Don't ever buy that. It's crap. Like, you're going to hate it in a week."
What was it?
And then I'll come to him.
What was the one that he said?
I think it was probably like, it was like some weird like chronograph or something like that was like either paved out or something like that. I can't remember off the top of my head. But for the inverse of that is I'll come to Marco with like Porsche stuff, and I'm like, "Hey, I'm thinking about like these wheels for this 911, or I'm thinking about like this shift knob or these seats." And he's like, "Dude, don't do that. That's like not OG. You want this or that, the other thing."
Right.
And his advice is like, don't make it look like a Christmas tree. Because you see these like enthusiasts that get into this stuff, and it's like, well, how can I like add more and add more on top of the more? And then, like you go to the car meet or whatever, and you see like this 911, it's like, of course it has flares. of course it has this steering wheel. Of course it has these lights, and it has a racing stripe and this exhaust. And then you're like, that it's like, what is missing from this? You literally have taken every element of like every iconic feature and put it all into the one car. And like those iconic features and those like really special details now get lost in it because there's just so much shit bolted onto this car. Right. And I think the same thing applies to maybe some watch design or designing things in like the modern era where it's like, you know, less is more, right? Sometimes the reason why these things are so cool and so awesome is like they're very simple, and it allows those like little special elements to really like jump off. Whereas like I think a lot of the collabs and a lot of design today is just like, let's bolt on more stuff,
right?
Like let's do this shirt and let's do this like really amazing design and then let's tie dye it. And you're like, wait, why? It would have been so much cooler if you like got like 75% of the stuff, removed 75% of the stuff and just left that 25% there.
Yeah.
And so I think that, you know, back to your point, I think going smaller with this stuff, doing things that are like simple, or things that like, I think maybe hopefully some of these brands will pay attention to. I mean, even like Rolex, for example, it's like, not only are you going to flip the entire watch upside down, but then you're going to do like this like wild bezel. And then you're going to do, and it's like just flipping a watch, the watch upside down would have been enough to like turn the market on its ass, right? You could have put a black bezel in there, right? An all black bezel instead of this black and green one. And it would have been rad. Or just take the normal GMT and do a black and green bezel. The market still would have like freaked out.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I've already seen people trying to sell the black and green bezel, like, so you could put it on your, you know, your right-handed, or sorry, your actual, you know, the left-handed correct model, that the right hand one that you wear on your left hand, whatever the fuck I'm saying. But you know, and then I think someone wanted like $8,000 for this ceramic insert.
Okay.
Which
to put like on like a normal,
yeah,
like
to just
GMT
put on regular GMT. Which I was just like, wow, okay. I don't even know how they're getting it, because that part had to get like smuggled out of the Geneva. But
was it in the blister pack and everything?
It was in it was in like the little like some sort of like not vacuum sealed, but like like a heat
little
sealed
like bubble thing.
Yeah. I know, right? Crazy. I don't know, that someone's got to be sneaking that out. Anyway, so this is a series of random questions I want to kind of go through here. Rapid fire, straight off the dome. If you were making a YouTube how-to video that did not involve watches, what would the subject be?
How to make perfect espresso or latte.
Oh, okay. What's the last movie you saw that you liked?
I might be like really cliche, but it was Top Gun.
Oh yeah, shit. That's a movie that everybody's.
There was some like really serious watch spotting in that movie too. So I was like, I loved it. Like it was so cool.
Okay, what's the last thing you bought online?
I bought a strap.
Okay.
Off of eBay. It's a vintage, like new old stock strap from 1964 to go on to this watch that I just bought for myself. It's a 1964 Benrus field watch.
Oh, like a military one?
Yeah. So I got this. This like came into the shop and I bought it for myself. And the strap just doesn't fit the right way, and it's not the original. So I bought a strap off of eBay for this watch in particular.
Ah, okay. What is a movie or a book that when someone mentions, you feel they understand you? Or an album?
Or an album?
Yeah.
Oh, I'd probably say like any Chet Baker album. If they know about like Chet, I'm like, oh, this is like my homie.
Drug addict guy?
Really funny.
Shooting heroin into your foot? Wasn't that Chet Baker? I mean, he was a genius.
What's wild is like all the jazz musicians out of like the 50s and the 60s were like crazy heroin addicts.
Yeah.
And I like never knew that until I started getting into jazz. And I'm like, why are all these guys like heroin addicts? You know, it's like wild.
What's your problem, man?
Yeah, it's like Art Pepper, Miles Davis, Chet.
Yeah.
What's funny though is I had a meeting with Wes Lang, who is an amazing artist, and he's also an amazing watch collector.
Yeah.
And I walked into a studio, and like in the corner on the floor of like this massive warehouse where he does his paintings, he has the Chet Baker album like Alone Together that was on the floor. And I was like, okay, this guy knows what's up.
Oh, damn.
That's a pretty emotional, like really detailed record. So
yeah.
Anyways.
What is a watch brand or specific reference or whatever that you're seeing right now that really excites you? Like something that's like getting popularity that maybe hadn't had it in the past?
I would say Nevada Grenchen, both on the vintage side and on the modern side. It's a brand that I really like. I think that their designs and what they were doing back in the 60s and into the 70s was like really cool and interesting and not too far off of like the course, for what I would look for in kind of like a watch to wear. The modern reissues that they are producing in Switzerland are just so awesome. It literally is the perfect blend of homage meeting like modern functionality, sapphire crystals, updated materials, upgraded movements, while not straying away too far from the classics. And I think that's really cool. So Nevada Grenchen, I think, is a brand that I would recommend people look at, both on the vintage side and on the modern side. And also, the cool thing is the price point is pretty consumable. You get a lot of value. That's another thing for me too, is like I can't get over people paying what they're paying for in this modern market with modern Rolex. It's ridiculous to me. Where
do you think it's going to cool down? Like, it's cooled down a tiny bit, but like, yeah.
Yes. I think what in the simple, this is my take on it. You had a lot of fair weather fans that were buying modern watches because they thought that they would make a good investment. And what ended up happening is you had suppliers purposefully, I think, limit the amount of release to increase demand. But you had a lot of people that were buying watches because they weren't really watch people. They weren't wearing the watches, and they were just kind of keeping these watches in their boxes and not taking the stickers off and, all that kind of stuff. And I think that is inevitably going to come down, because as soon as there's any kind of like market fluctuation, the first thing that moves is those assets. And so if they're true collectors and they have a true enthusiasm behind what it is that they're buying, it wouldn't be the thing that they're going to sell. It's like if you wanted to buy, a Rolex Paul Newman Daytona at any, part of the market, right? Good, bad, or whatever, it's going to be a challenge to do. Right? Or a good sub or a good Datejust or whatever. And there's an emotional connection to those items, which limits their amount of turnover in the market. Paired with a limited amount of supply to begin with, it's a much more stable market versus modern production meeting hype, meeting people that are not buying these things from an enthusiast-based perspective. I think that that's going to level the market for sure and bring it down.
Oh, damn. That's a very thorough answer.
I've thought a lot about this.
Yeah, as you should.
I'm also asked a lot by my clients, like, hey, what do you think of the modern market? How do you think the modern market is going to compare to the vintage market? And I don't think that like what I'm advising or saying is rocket science. It's not like I've got some like hidden agenda somewhere where I'm like, these are the watches you're going to buy. Like, I think the economics behind it are very simple, but I think the thing that really resonates with me and the truth is that, again, if I had a modern Porsche 911 that I could go out and buy at any single time because they're in production or whatever, I'm of course going to let that go versus like my, 75 or my 82 or whatever, where it's going to be really hard for me to find another one. I'm going to have an emotional connection to that. I'm not going to flip that back into the market if things kind of get unstable. And I think the same thing can be said for the modern watch market for sure.
Yeah, that's very, very true. Okay, to jump back to rapid fire stuff. 3-watch collection.
Do I have a price point?
No. 3-watch collection that you think that somebody could obtain one day. If it is like a Paul Newman Daytona, a Mill Sub, and a, Stella Dial Day-Date, maybe not.
Okay. So I would break that down into 3 categories. I would say a daily driver watch, a sports watch, and then a dress watch. So for the daily driver, I would probably say any Rolex Datejust. I really like the 4-digit Datejust, like the 1601s or the 1603s. I would say chef's choice on whatever you wanted to do from a material perspective. I think it could be steel, it could be two-tone, it could be gold if you wanted to. That's the beauty of a Datejust. The most iconic Rolex design ever produced. They're just as in style today as they were, when they released the Datejust. So it's an icon in itself. And I think the cool thing about a Datejust is you could wear it with anything. Steel Datejust on Jubilee, you could wear it with a suit, you could wear it with shorts, you could wear it casual, formal, whatever. So I would recommend first watch would be Rolex Datejust. For a sport watch, I would say, maybe like a Seiko or a Tudor. So a Seiko Turtle, whether it's vintage or modern. I think I'm really a big fan of Seiko. I know that you and I like connect on Seiko stuff a lot, but I think that like the brand is really cool. everything they do is in-house. They make their own luminous material. They make their own crystals. They're making their own movements. Like that to me is a sign of a good manufacturer when they're producing all that stuff in-house, and the price point's there. So I think like a vintage Seiko dive watch of some kind, or maybe even like a Seiko chronograph could be fun. And then for a dress watch, depending on your price point, I think that, something thin, time only maybe, or time and date, something maybe in gold. It doesn't have to be gold, but maybe something on the thinner side, like an Omega, like Seamaster dress watch, or a Cartier. There's some really awesome Cartiers. Like you can get a steel Cartier, or you could get a gold Cartier. You could get a black Cartier or plated Cartier. That would be nice. I think that design is just really elegant and timeless and handsome, and that would make for a good dress watch, and also one that provides like flexibility in its wearability. Look at that flexibility in its wearability.
There you go.
But something that like you could wear like as like a formal type of watch, but also something that would give you flexibility to wear it in maybe a more casual setting. And I think that's like the thing that the tank provides. It's such an iconic design. It's elegant and it's classy, but it's also functional. So Rolex Datejust would be my top pick. Seiko Diver or chronograph would be my second watch. And then I would say Cartier tank and any of the materials for like a dress watch would be my top three.
Is there a watch right now that you think is overrated? Like everybody's like, come on, like stop with that. Like for me, I'll go off. Like I think when someone walks in and they have a 5711, they have a Nautilus, and you're like, oh boy.
Yeah, I would say I would agree with you. I would say like a 5711 or like maybe like an AP. I think that those are kind of like a Royal Oak. Those are kind of a bit hyped out. The thing that I'm finding is that either people are kind of like, can I use the word fuckboy?
Yeah.
There's a few fuckboys.
There's definitely
fuckboys
in watches. They got the off-white shoes and the 5711 on the wrist. Yeah. And they're in line at Maru. Like
there you go. Yeah. And you're like, oh man, like if you just had one of these things, like going back to the Christmas tree theory, it's like you just had one thing, that thing would be like really cool and be like, oh, those are dope shoes, or oh, that's a dope watch. But you've got like, you kind of have like checked all the fuckboy boxes where I'm like, yep, yeah, you like you. So I would say, I'd kind of agree with you that that's like kind of an overplayed watch. But I'll tell you that there are true collectors that have like 5711s or those kinds of things that I think appreciate them for what they are. Generally speaking, those guys have not bought them at 140,000. They were just kind of like, they either bought them through an AD or whatever, and that kind of makes me happy because I like seeing watches in the wild like that. But yeah, I know a guy.
His dad got a Nautilus like way back in the day, and they gave him a discount on it because no one wanted to buy it because at the time people were looking for like things like the 3940 and like the higher complicated dress watches of Patek. So he has it's like a Tiffany stamped Nautilus that he got, I think, for like $16,000 or something like that at one point. I mean, it's crazy.
Awesome.
And like
he wearing
he wears a G-Shock.
Okay.
He's like, I'm not wearing this. He's like, it's because someone told him like what they're worth now, and now he's like, I don't want to be seen wearing that, and so I think
G-Shocks are cool. The Navy SEALs wear them, so like, why not? Like,
I'm all in on G-Shocks. I tend not to wear them that much because they're so big. Even this Omega swatch, the Moon swatch, I put it on my wrist, and I'm like, it's still a little big. Okay, fascinating. Well, Cam, thank you so much. It was good having you. I'll see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
All right.